I'm Michael Holland, and today I sat down with Bal Lotter, Blick Rothenberg Global Mobility Partner, and Arvinder Ubi, Partner at Ellis Porter, to talk all things US secondments and immigration. Here's what the guys had to say. Arvinder, we work with UK founders and entrepreneurs all the time who are forever pulled into the US. And for many of them, they won't think about immigration, they'll just assume that their ESTA is enough to get them into the States. What's the key things that a UK founder starting that expansion journey needs to think about?
Yeah, good question. So a lot of it's forward planning. Speak with advisors early and often, get your team in place, understand who you're going to go to for immigration, tax, relocation, all of those things. But it's really important for founders to understand the parameters around what they can do on an ESTA or a B1, when they need to start thinking about transitioning that to a work permit, like a midterm option, like L visa, E visa, or an O visa. And if they do run afoul and they're starting to push into engaging in work whilst they are on an ESTA, make sure that they're well aware of what they can do and come back to us and have a word and see what they need to do to take it to the next step.
And what's the difference between an L, an O, and an E visa?
Sure. So what we're really focused on is looking at the most appropriate work permit for both the individual applicant going to the US and the business, and we're trying to marry those together. So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. The L visa is great for multinational organizations. They have an entity outside of the US, one within the US. They're looking to transfer key employees as either managers, executives, or specialized knowledge workers. The E visa is based on a treaty of trade between multiple countries, the UK being one of those, and the US. And it allows companies who are making an investment into a US business that's owned at least 50% by UK nationals, and those individuals are going to lead and direct that organization in the US. They can also move key individuals either as the principal investor, the manager, executive, or an essential employee. And then the O visa is the extraordinary ability visa. So individuals who meet a high criteria, they may have received lots of awards of national or international recognition, held critical capacity roles, held a high salary. If they are seen to be a leader in their field and they meet that criteria, they can obtain a work permit to be able to go to the US in that O1 visa classification. And so again, what we look at is what's the profile of the applicant going over? What's the business need? How quickly do they need to go there? And which visa option is going to be the most appropriate for the business and the applicant.
Excellent. And Bal, these different types of visas, do they have direct tax consequences, or are they the start on a tax journey?
For the most part, they're a start on a tax journey, but there are certain visas that then have certain tax treatments attached to them. So, for example, student visas, typically, if you go into the US on a student visa to study, then under US domestic law, you may be taxed as though you're a non-resident. And generally speaking, with non-residents, your exposure to federal tax is limited to US source of income. It can also then mean that you may not need to pay the US equivalent of national insurance contributions, which is Social Security and Medicare. So I would say for the most part, a visa may be the start of the tax journey, but not always, because there is a slight disconnect between, you could be in the US, perhaps not on the right work authorization, but you could still become a US tax resident and liable to US tax.
Even under an ESTA?
Even under an ESTA. And, we've seen cases of clients that haven't taken advice early on, gone into the US under an ESTA, spent a significant amount of time in the US, and actually it becomes a complete surprise, not just to the founder, the executive, but also to the company when these individuals do trip over domestic tax residency and potentially under an agreement between the UK and the US, which is often for tax purposes called double tax treaty. Sometimes what can happen is they can shift from their home country into the US host country in terms of the US having a primary taxing right. So it can really cause a big tax problem.
And when would that typically come up? Is that when they're going farther in with your taxes and then now they suddenly hit with additional taxes or additional needs to file?
I think it typically comes up when somebody might go online, or they might, speak to their UK accountant And a UK accountant says, hang on a second here. You spent, 2/3 of the year in the US. Are you sure you haven't got some US tax issues there? And that's typically when Michael and I might be on a call with a client, unfortunately delivering that message that, yes, actually, you might have some US tax exposure. And actually, I think now's a good point to also illustrate the fact that the US has several different tiers of taxation. So the main tier of taxation is federal taxation. So whenever we talk about agreements between the UK and the US, more often than not, we're talking about an agreement between the UK authorities and the federal authorities in the US. But in the US, you also have states that impose their own sets of tax rules. And potentially, based on where you work and live, you might then have a tertiary level of taxation, which is often city or local taxation, as it's referred to in the US.
Excellent. And I think for many of the founders that we talk to, right at the beginning, you ask them, are you moving to the States? How long are you going to spend in the States? And they'll tell you as little as possible. I don't plan to be there. I don't plan to go. But if you're taking a business to the States, you need your people there, whether that's the founder or key individuals. And so what they'll do is actually over time begin to build up a number of days in the US. From your point of view, Arvind, from an immigration perspective, what's the key number of days that people need to take a stop and take a breath and think, oh, wait, I need to talk to an immigration advisor about this?
Yeah, it's not a hard and fast rule about number of days. What we're looking at are patterns of travel and activities in the US. So your activities are always going to control what classification of visa you require. If you are going to the US and you're attending meetings, going to conferences, trade shows, business development work, negotiating contracts, all of those are absolutely fine under the ESTA or the B1 visa. Where you need to be mindful of is if you are going to the US with a high degree of frequency, so that could be every month you're out there for 2 weeks, coming back to the UK or your home country for a short period of time, or you're spending up to 80 days, 85 days, coming back for a few weeks, heading back there for 60 days. Over a period of time, the officers will start to see your pattern of travel. If it looks like you're working in the US because you're spending more time there than you are outside, that's going to be the start of that scrutiny increasing. And you'll see that when you enter the US, officers may start asking more questions. They may ask you to go to secondary inspection. So those are kind of the key indicators that we look at. It's always driven by activities. We do genuinely have clients and founders who are going there for meetings. They're meeting with venture capital funds. They're trying to drum up business. They're doing marketing. They're trying to grow a team. And they really are just engaged in meetings and conferences. But it becomes very blurry, particularly when companies, like you said, start to say, hey, we actually need boots on the ground. Maybe we should change your title from head of operations to head of North American operations. And now you've got a US number, and now you actually have a couple of people in the US who may report to you. Then you're really blurring the lines, and you're probably going to start engaging in work activities at that point. And so, again, that's a good time probably before you get to that point to have those conversations and know when are you going to start blurring the lines. Do you need to start thinking proactively about work permits? Because like everything with the US government, it's not fast. Yeah, it takes a while.
And you're right. And that sort of situation bleeds into, from a corporate tax perspective, having that presence, having that visibility, having that an element, a place of control in the US begins to create a permanent establishment of your UK business. So that's the point at which we'd also suggest talking to us about a corporate structure and situation there. Bal, from your position, from a tax position, what's the number of days people need to start thinking about US tax?
Well, people often use 183 days as a yardstick. But I think it's worth at this point just clarifying how, certainly at a federal level, how residency is measured. So the way the federal test for residency is called the substantial presence test. So it takes the number of days that you spend in the current year, and it takes a fraction of the days from the 2 prior calendar years. That's days of presence in the US. So on average, if you spend more than 122 days in the US per calendar year, you could trip over that substantial presence test and be a domestic resident of the US. There are other levers that you could potentially pull. So, for example, if you continue to be a resident in the UK and most of your personal ties and connections are back in the UK, there's something called the closer connection exception under US domestic law, which gets you back to being treated as though you're a non-resident of the US. If, however, it's not possible to use that particular provision, then, as I mentioned before, there is an agreement between the UK and the US called a double tax treaty, and you could potentially get to a non-resident position through that, providing you meet all the criteria for that. So I would say, on average, if you're spending 22 days in the US, that's probably your trigger point. But I would say start a lot earlier. So in terms of getting the intended consequences, which is effectively to manage your exposure to double taxation, you probably need to take stock a lot sooner.
Well, yeah, absolutely, because 122 days is not an awful lot of time in the US. 4 months, a third of the year, it's really not a lot of time, particularly when you are there trying to meet VC, trying to set up US investments, set up US operations, meet US clients. Ideally, if there's a founder out there who's thinking about expanding into the US, either to access US investment or to access US clients and talent, when's the time to speak to you, Arvind? When's the time to get immigration advice?
As early as possible. So speak to us early and often. It is the key guidance we give. But generally speaking, most of the time you will know when you're starting to get to that point. So you're either traveling to the US with a lot of frequency, you're finding you're having to spend a lot of time there, your clients are demanding your presence in the US, you're starting to sell your goods or services there. You know that you're engaging in activities. Maybe now you need to start building a team. You really want to be tracking those, forecasting and saying, look, we're on this trajectory. We've been coming out to the US. We're gaining a lot of traction. We're probably going to have boots on the ground in the next 3 to 4, 5, even 6 months. Mm-hmm. That's when you really need to start having those serious conversations. You probably need to forecast a little bit before that as well and say, who are going to be my team of advisors that are going to help me take this journey from the UK to the US, get me there, get my team there if you need a team there, but advise you correctly so you're not running afoul of any types of issues. And one of the things we always talk to our clients about is, do you want to be that headline? Do you want to have to tell a client that you can't go to a pitch or you can't go and demo your product because of immigration issues, because you've been refused entry, because you were traveling to the US too much or you were deemed to be working there? So as early as often as you can, speak to your team of advisors.
That's really good advice. Given the current president in the US and his views on US immigration, have the rules changed? What should clients be aware of? What's the wait times at the moment?
Yeah, so we're sitting here August 2025. There have been substantial immigration changes. Fortunately, not too much on the employment-based side, which is what we're going to be talking about here. So the types of visas that we focus on, or my practice group particularly focuses on, are really deemed to be those investor visas, so E2s, individuals starting up new operations in the US, so companies moving to the US, job creation, investment into the US, those largely haven't changed. So E1, E2 visas out of London, we are still getting those approved. We've seen the time increase very slightly, so the time it takes for the US Embassy to review those applications has gone up by about 10 business days on average. So nothing crazy. That could change as the year continues and we go into 2026. Processing at the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, again, you have the benefit of being able to request that expedited form of review, which it hasn't changed. It is unlikely to change, and there hasn't been any discussion of it changing anytime soon. We've seen the adjudication get slightly more scrutinized. So some of the L1 applications, we're seeing those get a little bit more harshly decided, particularly for sales managers or anyone in sales really going into the US under the L1B category. But for new office L1s, so companies that have been operating in the US for less than a year, we're still seeing those get approved. The extensions are still getting approved. And you just need to be mindful of forward planning. So with those new office L1s, we're telling our clients, and we have done since we started this, make sure you know how to get the extensions approved, because that's your RSIC. For new office L1s, you only get 12 months, and that goes incredibly quickly. So you've got to make sure you're taking that route to hire the sufficient number of individuals, you've got the space available, and you're generating enough revenue in the US.
Amazing. And But from the perspective of many expanding businesses will want to send their key people from the UK to the US to help get things off the ground, but also to embed the culture of the business. So those L visas, what are the key things businesses need to think about when they're looking to send their employees to the US? What are the key tax considerations for both the business, the individual, and how you incentivize them to go?
I think there's a couple of things there. So mobility can take shape in a number of forms. So you've got your business travelers. So that's your individual that might be a UK employee, flies out to the US based on business need and then comes back. You've then got short-term secondments. So these are typically moves to the US that are typically structured as less than 12 months. And then you've got your longer-term secondments, which are your moves more than 12 months. And then you've got your permanent relocations. So that's effectively where you'd have a UK employee that would cease being a UK employee. And if, as part of your international expansion journey, you incorporate a business in the US, they would then transfer over to that business. Each one of those has different considerations. But I'd say the first thing is to understand the duration that you need the individual out in the US. That will determine which path you go down. Is it just a very short-term need, or is it a longer-term need? And then the other factor that businesses will look at is how will that individual's tax position change? So earlier I mentioned in the US, you've potentially got 3 levels of taxation. So that's federal taxation, state taxation, and local city taxation. How does that compare to the tax that they pay in the UK? The other consideration is often when you're asking an executive to move, it's not just the executive that's moving. It might be the spouse, it might be dependents. And so what businesses will typically do to incentivize that move is they will say, well, we'll give you healthcare, because a non-tax point here is in the US, they don't have the NHS. It's private medical, and the premiums are very expensive. So you've got those bits in terms of benefits, housing, perhaps schooling, a cost of living allowance. So if you're sending somebody from, let's say, Reading, and they're now going to be working in New York State, the cost of living is considerably more, and so businesses will look to make the individual whole on that difference in net income. And then ultimately, what the business might decide to do is a tax protection, which basically says we're gonna give you these benefits, we're gonna send you abroad, and if your taxes overseas are lower than they are back in the UK, you get to keep that windfall. Or the other version of that is tax equalization, where effectively the business says you're not going to pay any more tax than you would have had you remained in the UK. And if your tax burden increases as an individual as a result of us asking you to go overseas, then we will pick up that additional cost. So I think it's about having a clear understanding in terms of the options you have and the levers you have to incentivize that international expansion. But more importantly, understanding also as a business the cost of providing those benefits and that support package.
Perfect. That's a really, really well articulated. Thank you, Val. If there's a founder or a CFO watching this who suddenly realizes actually they've been spending a lot of time in the US, or they've been asking their people to spend a lot of time in the US, what should they do if they think they might have already tripped over something?
I think they should almost certainly seek professional advice. And actually the starting point, in my view, would be not just looking at their time, but also assessing what they're doing, because this is going to cut across many different areas. So as you've mentioned, corporate tax exposure, and as Arvinder's mentioned, immigration as well. So some of these things, they can be retrospectively dealt with and managed. But I'd say speak to someone, get some advice.
Well, that certainly is an awful lot to think about for founders expanding into the US. Thanks so much for your time and your insights.